Hey everyone, and welcome to the PML channel. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to produce a melodic techno track using Ableton Live, Serum 2, and sounds from the PML library. My name is Matt Tinkler. I'm an Ableton certified trainer, producer, and YouTuber, and I'm super excited to be here on the PML channel breaking down this track for you. The project file I'm going to be breaking down is part of the Melodic Techno sound pack Mesmerize, which also includes a bunch of high quality drum samples and Serum presets. There'll be a link to check that out in the description, but for now, let's get to the track. Let's take a listen to the loop we're going to be breaking down in this video. Let's take a look at the drums by recreating this loop over here at bar 17, starting with the kick drum. So I'm going to open up the kick drum track here and let's copy over this kick drum MIDI by holding down Option or Control and dragging it over to bar 17. And let's just take a listen to the kick drum on its own. Really simple, we can see we've just got a kick drum sample loaded up here inside of Simpler, and if we double click to open the MIDI clip, scroll down, we can see that we just have a single MIDI note on C3 playing every single beat of the bar, which is giving us that 4 on the floor kick drum feeling. And here we've got the note on C3 because that means it's playing back the sample at its original pitch and length. Let's switch back to the device view with Shift and Tab. And you'll notice if we take a look at this 16 bar loop, the kick drum actually doesn't play here for the last 2 bars or so because it's filled up by other elements. Speaking of those other elements, let's dive into the snare next. Let's fold up the kick drum, unfold the snare, and hold down Alt or Command, click and drag this across to bar 17, solo the snare, and take a listen. So the snare is pretty simple. If we open up the MIDI clip, scroll down, we can see we just have a single MIDI note on C3 playing every second beat or the backbeat. And that's giving us this classic kick snare pattern. If we unsolo the snare, you'll hear this in context. But let's solo the snare again, switch back to the device view with Shift and Tab, and take a look at the processing we have going on the snare here. So all we have here in the snare is this chain that contains an LFO, Max for Live device, followed by this ducking rack here, which contains a Max for Live shaper device, which is linked to the gain of this utility control here. If I turn off this rack, take a listen to what the snare sounds like just by itself. You can hear it has this really long kind of reverberant tail. So what this rack is doing here is basically making it so that every half bar, this LFO here is turning on or off this whole ducking rack. And all this ducking rack is doing is basically just adding a volume envelope to the snare so that it either cuts it off abruptly or lets the whole thing pass through, which results in this kind of long, short snare sound. Beyond that, there's no other processing going on the snare here, but this creates some really nice variation in the snare sound. Next, let's close up the snare and take a look at the cymbals group. You can see this cymbals group is made up of 3 different loops here. We have this hi-hat loop, a noise hit, and this fast hats. Let's drag these over one by one to our new loop so we can take a listen to what they sound like. Let's start with the hi-hat loop, hold down Option or Control, click and drag this over, and let's solo our cymbals group so that we can hear this hi-hat loop. We also can see we've got some processing on the cymbals group, which we'll talk about in a moment. Next, let's grab this noise hit loop, hold down Option or Control, click and drag this over, and solo this so we can take a listen to what it sounds like. And you can see it's only just playing this little noise hit kind of on the last half beat of the bar. Lastly, you can see we have this fast hi-hat loop. Again, no processing on this, but let's click and drag this over, solo this, take a listen to what it sounds like. And then if we listen to all of these cymbals together in this cymbals group, we can hear that they add together to create this nice groove. Now on the cymbals group here, we also have this EQ8, which is doing some mid-side EQ processing, just dragging down a little bit of these harsh frequencies in the sides, boosting some of the very high frequencies in the sides as well. And if we switch to the mid mode, we can see that we're dragging down those harsh frequencies even further in the mid here. Without the EQ8, our loop sounds like this. And with the EQ8. It's a very subtle addition, but helps in the greater context of the mix to just smooth out the hi-hats against everything else. Let's close up the cymbals group and take a look at the next part of the drums, which is this effects noise hat sound. Let's copy this over to our new loop, unfold it, solo it, and take a little bit of a listen just to the last few bars of this or so. Now, you might notice that this sound is actually made using Serum 2, but before we get to that, let's take a quick look at the MIDI clip, where we can see we just have a simple pattern that just is a da 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 da. A very simple, interesting, syncopated pattern for this hi-hat. Let's go back to our device view, open up Serum 2, and we can see here that if we switch to the oscillator tab, we just have a simple noise going on in the oscillator that's running through some high pass filtering. In the effects tab, we have some hyper dimension, which is just adding some space to the sound. And then the most important element of the synth is that we actually have the mod wheel controlling the decay of envelope 1. And if I close up this Serum 2 patch and take a look down at Serum 2 in the device view, we can see that the mod wheel is actually being automated. If I open up my automation, we can see that this mod wheel is actually getting higher and higher towards the end of the loop before then coming back down, meaning that the hi-hat is getting a gradually longer and longer decay, so becoming longer and longer, and then fading back down towards the end of the loop. Let's turn off the processing here so that you can hear what this sounds like a little bit. Next, we have this little mix control Ableton Live rack here, which is bringing down the volume by 8 dB and then increasing the stereo width just by 50%. Then we have an EQ8, which is being used to just remove low frequencies, tame some of these high mids here, and boost these higher frequencies to give it more of a hi-hat-like characteristic. Then we have a delay, which is just being used to add some subtle ping pong delay to the sound to give it a little bit of width and space. And lastly, we have this rack here, which is called ducking. And all this is doing is using the Shaper Max for Live device to control the output gain of this utility right after it with a custom curve here to kind of mimic the effect of a sidechain ducking or sidechain volume shaping, just not super intense. And just a quick note on this, you'll notice that the max value of the shaper is set to 50%, and that ensures that this gain at the highest point of this curve here goes up to 0 dB and not any higher, meaning that all this curve in this shaper is doing is reducing the volume of the sound rather than increasing the volume of the sound. We have the rate set to 1 quarter note, and that's what's giving us this kind of quarter note ducking effect. Let's move on from this effects noise hat to the tom. Let's copy over the MIDI clip from the tom to our new loop, solo the tom, and take a listen. Let's open up the MIDI clip, and you can see we have this very simple pattern just going back and forth between 2 notes to repitch the same tom sample. If we go back to our device view and turn off all of the processing, we can hear what this tom sounds like just by itself. In the simpler, we just have the tom sample loaded up. It's being transposed down by 9 semitones. Then we have, again, this mix control rack, which is just bringing down the volume by about 8 decibels, followed by some EQ to just remove some low frequencies and boost some of these mid and higher frequencies in the sound, followed by some slight delay here, which is just being used to add a little bit of what we'd call like a slapback delay to the sound with a very, very short decay time of 30 milliseconds. We have the filter focused in on the higher frequencies here and a dry wet of 25%. Take a listen to what this does to the sound. If I increase the dry wet a little bit, You start to hear those two distinct clicks of the tom drum, which is what we're doing with this delay, just at a lesser extent. Let's undo that with Command and Z and move on to the next effect, which is this auto pan. And all this auto pan is doing is basically just making it so that the tom is moving between the left and the right speakers every bar. If we turn this on, we can see we have an amount of 100 at a rate of 1 bar, a phase of 180 degrees, and an offset of 90 degrees here, which is basically making it so that we have the sound bouncing back and forth between the left and the right speakers over the course of a single bar. And that, in conjunction with the MIDI pattern that we have, makes it so that it sounds like we have the higher tom coming from one side and the lower tom coming from another side. Lastly, we're following this up with a utility just to bring up the gain a little bit more. And that's all of the processing we have here on this tom. And those, for the most part, are our core drum sounds. Let's solo the drum group as a whole and take a look at the drum group and just see that we have some processing going on here, which is a compressor followed by a saturator in digital clip mode. And what these two are doing in conjunction with one another is basically just making it so that the very loud transients of these sounds, when combined, such as the kick and the snare, are just being squashed, pulled down in level in a fairly transparent way. Let's take a listen to the loop with the compressor and saturator off. And now with the compressor and saturator on. You can see the compressor is mostly acting when the kick and the snare are playing together, and all of the sounds are being driven into this digital clip saturator, which is hard clipping the entire drum group, just very subtly to control the transients. Lastly, you'll note we have this tom fill here. I'm just gonna select the last 2 bars, copy and paste this to the final 2 bars of our loop, solo this tom fill to take a listen to what it sounds like. And all this is a sample just being run through some delay. Turn off the delay. And this tom fill is just being used to aid the transition back around to the beginning of the loop or the next section in the case of a full arrangement. And it's also worth noting that this tom fill here, as well as the original main tom sound, are both being sent to this hall reverb, which is just adding some reverb to these sounds, but we'll come to the sends later because we're doing something cool with them too. Let's close up the toms, and our last element of the drums is this snare sound. Let's copy the last 8 bars of this, paste it to the last 8 bars of our loop, solo this snare, and take a little bit of a listen to it. And you can hear it's basically just a snare roll that again is aiding in transition back to the beginning of the loop or the next section. If we take a look at the MIDI clip, scroll down, you can see we just have this 16th note snare pattern here with each of the second 16th notes just offset slightly to create a little bit of a groove or swing. And if we take a look back to our device view, we can see we just have a simple snare sound in the simpler here. And let's turn off all of this processing and take a listen to what that snare sound sounds like just by itself. Very simple snare sound, but one thing we are doing with the snare sound in the simpler, if we go to the controls tab, is automating the transposition control to increase over this last 2 bars. If I open up the automation, we can see that we have the transposition here increased over the last 2 bars, which is giving it that pitching up effect. Next, we have this mix rack here, which is just, again, bringing down the volume by 8 dB just to control the level a little bit. Then we have that followed up by an EQ8, which is boosting some of these mid frequencies and these high frequencies, followed by some stereo control here, which is just being used to add some subtle stereo width to the sound. And this is a cool little rack that's just kind of adding a little bit of side to the signal by using some delay in the side channels. If we solo the side here, that's what's being added to the signal. And then lastly, we have an auto filter on low pass mode, which is just being automated throughout the entirety of this snare roll to just increase over time. And this snare roll in conjunction with the tom fill create a really nice turnaround back into the beginning of the loop, or again, a following section. Next up, let's get into the synth sounds, starting with the basses. So we can see there are 2 basses in this track. We have this bass sub and this bass reese. Let's begin with the bass sub just by clicking and dragging this, copying the MIDI over to our new loop, soloing this bass sub, and let's take a listen to the sound. Let's open up the bass track and double click to open up the MIDI clip here so we can see exactly what's going on. And we can see we just have a very simple syncopated pattern, which is just starting on the G sharp, going down to the F sharp, down to the E, and back up to the F sharp to create a very simple harmonic movement. Let's switch back to our device view, turn off the processing, and open up Serum 2 so we can take a look at the sound. So although this might look fairly complex, it's actually a fairly simple sound. We have this main oscillator here playing this IK and has kick wavetable. This is playing 3 octaves below the incoming note. Let's just take a listen to this oscillator by itself. We've just chosen a nice position for the wavetable here, run it into a filter, and then we have this filter cutoff controlled by envelope 2, which is giving it that plucky characteristic. Then we're layering this with oscillator B, which is just a sine wave playing 2 octaves below the incoming note. And then we have a sub oscillator, which is playing 1 octave below the incoming note, and a third oscillator with oscillator C, which is also playing 1 octave and 5 semitones below the incoming note. So basically a fifth above the other oscillators, except what we're doing here with this sub oscillator and oscillator C is running them through the bus 1 in our effects tab. This bus has 2 EQs on it just to really shape the tone of the sound. And if we turn off oscillator A and oscillator B, we can hear what these oscillators are adding to the sound. Just this very subtle, higher pitched layer. Let's turn on oscillator A and oscillator B once again. And then it's worth noting that the levels of these oscillators are also being controlled by different modulators. The level of the sub and oscillator C here are both being controlled by envelope 3, and the level of oscillator A and oscillator B are both being controlled by LFO 2, which you can see just has a little bit of room at the beginning to just allow the transient of the oscillator C and sub oscillator to cut through a little bit more, giving it a little bit more of a wompy characteristic. And the very last thing worth noting here is that LFO1 is actually controlling the main or global tuning amount to give the sound a little bit more of a pluck at the beginning. We've done this by going to the matrix view, selecting LFO1 as the source, selecting main tuning as the dropdown under the global section, and then adjusting the modulation amount here with this modulation slider. Let's close up Serum 2 and take a look at what we've got going on inside of Ableton Live. Now, the first thing I just want to draw your attention to is that on the bass group, we actually have this saturator here, which is driving the sound to add some distortion and saturation. I'm going to turn this off for the moment so that we can hear the sound without the saturator. And so here we have now just this bass sound in Serum 2 followed by this mix control, which is again bringing down the level by 8 dB. Then we have this EQ8, which is just bringing up an area in the very low frequencies and this area here in the kind of low mid frequencies. Just very subtle. And then in between these, could be after the EQ8, we again have this ducking setup with a little bit of a different ducking curve to what was going on in the hi-hat, but you can see that this is basically just being used as our sidechain replacement in this particular instance. So what's happening here is that every single beat, this shaper is being triggered and reducing the volume of the sound to make it sound like it's pumping in time with our 4 to the floor kick drum. Next, let's turn our attention to this bass Reese sound. Let's copy over the MIDI, close up the bass subtrack, open up the bass Reese, solo this, and take a listen to what it sounds like. Let's go ahead and turn off all of this processing and open up the Serum 2 patch. Let's take a quick look at the MIDI first, just by double clicking on the MIDI clip, and you can see we're playing the exact same notes basically as the bass sub, except this time we have them long and elongated rather than that kind of rhythm that was playing in the bass sub sound. Let's switch back to our device view, turn off all of our processing, and open up Serum 2 to take a look at the sound. Now, this sound is super simple. We just have a sawtooth wave here on the basic shapes wavetable, playing 3 octaves below the incoming note, with a unison of 8 voices and a detune around the middle here. And if we turn off the low pass filter, you'll hear what this sounds like just by itself. That really nice, buzzy, thick sound. And then when we run that through the filter, we're just reducing and removing all of those higher frequencies to really just make this a nice warm bass sound. And that's it for the sound inside of Serum 2. There's no modulation, there's no effects going on, it's just literally this detuned sawtooth wave running through a low pass filter. So let's close up Serum 2 and take a look at the processing we're doing in Ableton Live. First of all, we have this mix control, which is again default bringing down the level of the sound by 8 dB, which is important for that saturator on the bus. Then we have 3 different EQ8s. This first EQ8 here is just really drastically low passing the sound and boosting this kind of low mid area. Next up, our second EQ8 here is just low passing it once again with a little bit of a gentler slope. And this is adding to the first low pass in this first EQ8 to just give it a much more dull and warm characteristic. Next, our last EQ8 here is actually a mid-side EQ. We can see the EQ8 here is in mid-side mode. And all this is doing is just reducing the level of the low frequencies in the sides quite drastically using a low shelf. Not completely removing them because we don't want them completely removed in this instance, but just drastically reducing them to just center the sound a little bit more in these low frequencies. And lastly, we have a compressor here, which is just doing our sidechain compression. You can see this is automated. It doesn't need to be at the moment, so I'll just right click and delete that automation. And we're using this on this track in place of the ducker that we were using on the previous track, just so that we can have a little bit of a different movement to the sound. This compressor is being fed by the kick drum, and so what's useful about this is that it also means when the kick drum is not playing, we do not have any sidechain pumping going on in this bass sound, but we can keep the sidechain pumping going on in the other sounds like the bass sub and in the cymbals because those are using that ducker effect. And this just helps to fill out the space a little bit more. And lastly, of course, we can go to the bass group and turn on this saturator, which we've used and driven by 9 decibels, taken the output down by 9 decibels, turned on the soft clipping mode. And this has just allowed us to add a little bit more warmth, saturation, and to glue these 2 bass sounds together. Let's now take a listen to these 2 bass sounds soloed and then in context with the rest of the loop. Let's move on from the bass and take a look at our main instruments group here. So let's start with this pluck saw. Let's unfold this track, copy and paste the MIDI over to our new loop, solo this track, and take a listen. Now, right off the bat, you can hear that this sound has a lot of space and reverb and delay added to it. This is mainly through these 2 sends here, which I'm just going to turn off so that we can take a listen to the sound without those 2 return effects. Then let's mute all of the processing that we've got going on and then open up our MIDI clip so that we can just see what's going on in the MIDI here. We have a fairly complex rhythmic pattern, but it's a very simple harmonic movement. We just have the chords playing at the beginning of each of these 2 bars in this kind of repeated 8th note pattern, which are just preceded by these kind of interesting rhythmic stabs. And this is really the main hook of the track. So what you were hearing there was just the basic Serum sound. So let's take a look at this patch in Serum 2. And once again, this sound is very simple. We have just a sawtooth in oscillator A, followed by this kind of more gentle sawtooth here in oscillator B, both of which are running into filter 1, which is this low pass filter, which has its cutoff being controlled by envelope 3 to create this kind of plucky effect. It's also worth noting that oscillator B has 8 unison voices and is slightly detuned, which is what's giving the sound a little bit more width and kind of character as well. Then next we have a bunch of effects on this sound in the effects tab. You can see we have some distortion, some EQ here, which is reducing the low frequencies, a filter, a second low pass filter, which is also being modulated by some of the modulators here, a chorus, and a reverb. If I bypass all of these effects, you can hear what the sound sounds like without them. And then turn them on one by one. We have some distortion, some EQ, which is doing quite a lot to reduce the low frequencies of this sound. This filter, which we can see is being modulated with its cutoff. Some chorus, which is just a very subtle way of adding some width to the sound, followed by some reverb, which is really giving this sound a lot of space and filling the gaps in between these quite sparse rhythmic sounds. Now there's a few extra things going on here. For instance, we have envelope 2, which is actually the one modulating the cutoff of the filter here in the effects section. And we have LFO 1, which is actually modulating the fine of the tuning of oscillator A, which is just giving it a little bit of kind of movement and warble to the pitch of this sound, just very, very gently. And lastly, we also have a macro 1 here and the modulation wheel, which are being used to control various parameters of the filter and the effects. For instance, this macro 1 here is being used to control the filter and the EQ in the effects, and the modulation wheel is being used to control the main filter. And these are both being automated over the course of the loop. If we open up our automation, we can see the main macro here is kind of all the way open, but we do have the ability to potentially automate this if we want. And then the modulation wheel is also being automated throughout, just to give the sound a little bit more interesting movement. Now, once again, on the group, we do have this saturator, so I'm just going to turn this off for the moment so that we can hear the sound without all of that distortion whilst we go through the effects on the sound itself. And here we can see we have this mix control, which is again bringing down the dB of the sound by 8 and increasing the stereo width by 50%. Then we're also following this with 3 EQ8s, one here which is just really gently reducing the level of most of the mid and high mid frequencies of this sound, whilst also taming the highs with this low pass filter. Then another EQ8 here, which is some mid-side EQ that's being used to boost those levels in the side and again reduce them just a little bit in the mid. Followed again by another EQ8, which is just boosting the kind of low mids here in the side channels specifically, which gives the sides just a little bit more warmth and nice character to this sound. You can particularly hear it on the reverb. And of course, we're following this up with a delay, which is on 8th notes, ping pong, with some nice amounts of feedback here, and just filtering the delay so it's more in the mid frequencies of the sound. And of course, we have this sound being sent to return A here, which is this reverb, and return B, which is this very, very, very long delay. And altogether, it sounds like this. You can hear that delay and reverb really trailing out there quite a lot. Next, let's move on to this pad verb sound. Let's close up the pluck saw, open up this pad verb, copy over the MIDI, which is actually exactly the same MIDI as is playing in this pluck saw sound. Solo this and take a listen to what it sounds like. We can hear it's a very simple, subdued kind of sound. Let's turn off the processing here and open up Serum 2. And this is again a very simple sound. We have 2 sawtooth waves layered with each other. Both have 16 voices of unison with a decent amount of detune. The amplitude envelope here has a little bit of a decay, but also quite a long release. And both of these oscillators are running through a low pass filter here. And we have some fairly large reverb on the effects. Now it's also worth noting, once again, we have the modulation wheel here being used to control the cutoff of filter 1. And if we open up our automation, we can see that this is just getting reduced over the course of this full 16-bar loop, just taming the pad over the course of the loop. Then we once again have this mix control, bringing the level down by 8 dB, followed by an EQ8, which is reducing or removing all of these low frequencies and just taming these really low mid frequencies as well to fit the sound nicely together with all of the other sounds going on, particularly this pluck saw. It just fills out the space really nicely when paired with the pluck saw sound. Let's move on to the next instrument, which is this lead saw sound. Copy this over to our loop and take a little bit of a listen. Let's open up the device view, turn off the processing and mute the return track A, which this is being sent to, before opening up Serum 2. So here, once again, we have a very simple sound, just a sawtooth wave with 5 voices of unison, some relatively moderate detune running through a low pass filter. And then in the effects tab, we have some reverb and some EQ, which is just being used to reduce the low frequencies of the sound. But then what's mainly giving this sound its interesting gliding characteristic is if we look down here, we can see the sound is in mono, and we also have the portamento mode set to always with a relatively high portamento time of 320-ish milliseconds, which means that every single new note will have its pitch glided to from the previous note. You can hear that the next note just kind of started, it didn't have any pitch slide into it. So that's why this always control here is really useful for this sound. Let's close up Serum 2 and take a look at the processing we've got going on. Once again, we have this mix control reducing the level by 8 dB, followed by this EQ8, which is quite drastically removing all of these low frequencies and boosting some of these frequencies up here in the high mids. Quite a drastic EQ movement there, followed by an auto pan, which is just really subtly moving the sound from left to right. And of course, we're running this through that whole return, which is adding a nice amount of spacious reverb to the sound as well. Next up, let's take a look at the final instrument sound, which is this lead saw 2. Let's close up lead saw 1, open up lead saw 2, copy and paste the MIDI over to bar 17 and solo this sound, then take a listen to what we're working with. You can hear it's this very, very high-pitched kind of quite harsh grating sound almost. And if we open up the MIDI, you can see that we're just playing these quite long, interesting notes that work well with all of the other notes going on in the other instruments. Now, of course, we're also sending this to that whole return track. So let's mute that for the moment, mute these 2 effects, and take a look at the Serum 2 patch, which is for the most part basically exactly the same as the previous lead saw sound, just with a few more unison voices, a little bit more detune, and a little bit of a more open low pass filter here. We also have basically the exact same reverb and pretty much a very similar EQ as well. And of course, we have the portamento set to always at a very similar rate of around 350 milliseconds or so. This is the Serum sound by itself. Quite high-pitched and quite harsh, but when we add the effects to it and chuck it in the context of the mix, it fills out the space quite nicely. So let's close up Serum 2, and we can see we've got this mix control, again, just bringing the level down by 8 dB, followed by this EQ8, which is very drastically high-passing the sound and just reducing some of these kind of more mid-frequencies around 2K as well, which is mostly where the fundamental frequencies of these particular notes are actually lying. Then we're sending this sound to that return A hole here, which is giving it a bunch of nice space. And then all of our instruments are actually running through this instruments group, which has this sidechain compressor on it, which is very similar to the sidechain compressor that was on our bass Reese. Let's solo all the instruments and then turn this off so you can hear what it's doing. just very subtly ducking the sound in time with the kick drum. And then we're running all of these sounds into this saturator, which is driving the sound by 9 decibels, pulling it back by 9 decibels, and again, just adding some nice subtle saturation to all of the instruments and kind of gluing them together. Lastly, let's take a look at the sounds in this effects group right down the bottom, beginning with this noise downlifter sound. Let's copy and paste this over to the beginning of our new loop, and we can see if we open this up, this is actually a MIDI clip playing a C3 note for 2 bars, and if we solo this, we can hear what it sounds like. Now this is actually a sound from Serum 2. Let's turn off these 2 processors right here. Let's just leave on this mix control because all it's doing is reducing the sound by 8 dB, and turn our attention to Serum 2, which we can see we have just a noise oscillator here running through filter 1, which is using a bandpass filter, which has its cutoff position being modulated by LFO 1, which has this kind of ramp down movement, creating this kind of falling effect. Then if we go to the effects tab, we can see we're running this sound through some hyperdimension, just using the dimension section to add a little bit of space to the sound. And that's really all that's going on here with this sound inside of Serum 2. So let's close this up. Again, we have that mix control, which is bringing the volume of this sound down by 8 dB, followed by an EQ8, which is just very drastically high passing the sound and reducing some of these mid frequencies, just to focus the sound a little bit more on the higher end of the frequency spectrum. Next, we have this exhaust sound, which we can actually see happens twice, right at the end and right at the beginning. So I'm going to copy this with Command and C, paste this at bar 17, and let's turn off this EQ here and take a look at the audio clip. We can see it's just this very simple kind of exhaust sound that sounds like this. Just this reverberated clap, which is happening right at the beginning of the loop and also right at the end on this last beat, which is just helping out with the tom fill right at the top. And you can hear that cuts off very abruptly. And if we solo this with the tom fill, just works nicely as a moment in the fill. Let's zoom out and take a look at this EQ8, which is just being used to reduce these mid frequencies and boost the higher frequencies. And combining this kind of reverberated clap with the noise downlifter creates a nice impact at the beginning of the loop. Our final 2 effect sounds, this noise and this noise transition, are being used to, again, aid the transition between the end of the loop and the beginning of the loop or the start of the next section. We have this noise here, which if I copy and paste this into the last few bars of our main loop, we can see this is again just a single bar long MIDI note playing C3. And if I solo this, we can hear it's basically just some noise that's being made inside of Serum 2. Let's turn off this processing here and open up Serum 2. And we can see once again, it's just a very simple noise, which has its level being controlled by LFO 1 here, just as a little bit of a dip and an increase, just to shape the volume of it slightly, running through this kind of high pass filter here. And in the effects tab, we have a little bit of hyperdimension being used to add just, again, a little bit of width and kind of more character to the noise with this hyper section. Let's close up Serum 2. Then we're following the sound with EQ8 just to remove some low and high frequencies. This kind of same stereo control rack that we were using on one of the previous sounds to add some more interesting kind of synthetic side width to the sound with a Haas effect type thing. Followed by an EQ8 to just bring out these higher frequencies in the sides of the signal. And this combined with the exhaust sound and the tom fill works again really nicely as a way of kind of creating an interesting turnaround into the next section. As our final sound, let's take a look at this noise transition copy this over to the last 4 bars of our track, solo this and take a listen. Once again, we're using Serum 2 to create this sound. Let's turn off this EQ8, open up Serum 2, and all we have here is just some noise running through a fairly resonant bandpass filter with, again, some hyper dimension being applied to the sound to give it a little bit more width, character, and space. But then we also have the level of the noise and the cutoff frequency of the filter being controlled by the modulation wheel, which is what we're automating over the course of this 4 bars to create that kind of sweep effect. We can see we're starting all the way down on the modulation wheel and going all the way to the top over the course of this 4 bars to give it that sweep effect. Again, we're running this through an EQ8 to remove some low and high frequencies and focus it on this more high mid range. And in context, this sound with the exhaust sound, the other noise, and the snare roll and the tom fill create a really nice turnaround at the end of the loop to the beginning of the loop as well. Now that's it for all of the sounds of this loop, but there is one more interesting thing that we're doing with these 2 return tracks being sent to this sends audio track here right down the bottom of our session. So we've had a few of the instrument and drum sounds being sent to this whole return track, which has a fairly large reverb on it, followed by an EQ8, and this echo return track, which has a fairly long delay, again being followed by an EQ8, to create a little bit more space in the track. I can go ahead and solo both of these so you can hear exactly what they're doing. And if I open these return tracks up, we can see that they're both being sent in this I/O section to our sends audio track. And this audio track is monitoring its input, which means that we're basically processing both this hall and this echo return track on this single sends audio track in our arrangement view. Now, why this is interesting is because we're using this sends track to apply some sidechain compression and some EQ to both of these return tracks. And this is just helping to carve these sounds out of the mix a little bit, helping them move in time with the rest of the track and reduce their impact in this kind of mid-frequency range on other sounds. Now, if you are doing this, it is important to go to the sends on this sends track and make sure they are disabled. You can do this by right-clicking, and in our case it says enable here, so let's enable all sends, right-click and then disable them. And what this does is basically make it so that this track is now compensating for any latency introduced in the project. Otherwise, there's some potential for some weird latency to be introduced if these sends are left enabled on this track. Lastly, let's turn our attention to the master track here, which we can see has some compression, some hard clipping saturation, and some limiting being applied as a way of just bringing up the level of this track and helping glue everything together. If I turn off the mastering chain, this is what the track sounds like without it. And then with it, it's going to be quite a bit louder and sound a little bit more glued together. You can see this compressor is just applying some very gentle peak compression. This saturator is applying some clipping to the signal to reduce the level of the transients, and this limiter is just bringing up the level to the maximum allowable level and carving off some extra peaks just to give it a little bit more loudness and fullness. By the way, if you're new to producing and want to learn Ableton Live inside and out, make sure to check out the Beginner to Advanced Ableton Live course over on the PML website, where you'll learn everything you need to know about Ableton Live to begin producing your own music. Now that we've gone through all of the different elements of this loop, let's take a look at how we can turn it into a full track by arranging it out inside of Arrangement View. To start with, let's go ahead and zoom out, and I'm just going to select this amount of time here all the way up to bar 97, then press Command or Control and I on my keyboard. And that's going to insert a bunch of silence here from bar 1 to 97 for us to begin structuring our track. Let's add a little bit more just by selecting another kind of 16 bars or so, pressing Command or Control and I to push everything else back. And now let's use locators to kind of template out an arrangement. Let's go to bar 1, right click up the top and click Add Locator, call this the intro. Now our intro can last for 8 bars. So let's right click at bar 9, add a locator, and let's say this is where we want the synths to come in. Then we can build up this intro all the way up to bar 33, where we can have a bit of a breakdown. And this breakdown here can begin to build up all the way to bar 65, where we can have a little bit of a gap, let's call it a break, before our drop comes in after 4 bars. So let's zoom in here at bar 69. Let's say the drop comes in here, and then our drop can last for, let's say 32 bars. So let's just select 32 bars, right click here, and this is where our outro can begin. And then our outro can last for, let's say 16 bars, and this is where the track can end. Now, of course, this is a fairly rough template, but now we can start filling in the gaps with the elements of our loop. Let's start with the kick drum. So copy and paste this throughout our intro. And again, leave a little bit of a gap here right at the end of the intro. Then let's grab this bass sub, loop this until the end of the intro as well, but let's double click to the clip and reduce the length of the loop of this MIDI clip to 2 bars. So we're just looping this first G sharp note here. Then we can just build up the drums over the course of the intro. Let's say we start with the toms. They can run all the way through to the end. We can open up the cymbals and bring in, say, these first 2 loops when the synths come in. Let's duplicate that and cut that in half. And then bring in this fast hi-hats, maybe at bar 17. And then we can also bring in this effects noise hat at the same point. Then let's go ahead and grab our synths, maybe just start with the Pluxor and the pad verb. Let's copy these over to bar 17 and just extend them back a little bit so they actually start where it says synths here, but not at the start of the loop, just at that last end of it. And to create a little bit of variation, let's have these extended through the breakdown, but opening up the clips. Let's select everything with Command and A, hold down Shift and press the up key or the up arrow on our keyboard to bring these all up 1 octave, and then do the same with the pad verb MIDI as well. So they just have a little bit of a different flavor and feel in the first half of this track before we bring them down to the main octave in the drop. Let's bring in this first lead saw sound here at bar 17 as well. And then we have a nice little intro that builds up slowly towards the breakdown of the track. Let's not forget as well to bring in the snare at bar 17. And let's use the automation on the Pluxor here, say on the mod wheel, to just open up this sound over time. So let's delete this and just open it up over time here, and do the same with the pad verb, opening it up over time. And let's also delete this macro 1 here, and we can maybe increase this over the course of these last 8 bars or 16 bars in the breakdown. Let's now flesh out the breakdown a little bit. Let's start by bringing in this respace here at maybe say bar 49, or maybe a little bit earlier, actually bar 41. And let's also bring in the 2 lead saws as well at bar 49. And then use this noise transition here to start increasing the intensity towards this break before the drop. And we can also start introducing the drums in this breakdown as well, potentially the kick drum at bar 49, the snare drum, and maybe this first hi-hat loop as well. Then over the course of this breakdown, let's have this mod wheel quite low and then begin to increase, as well as the mod wheel of the pad increases too towards the end of the breakdown. Let's bring in this snare roll towards the end of the breakdown as well. And then this tom fill can maybe come in here at the end of the break, just before the drop. And we can also grab these two effectsy sounds to go along with it. Let's also automate the mod wheel of this lead saw 1 here, just to increase over time of this breakdown so it doesn't come in too drastically. And let's also go ahead and on the kick drum, let's add an auto filter, set it to high pass, pull the filter frequency down, and have this engaged by right-clicking, showing automation in new lane for the whole first half of the track, so that we don't have that really low-end bass come in until right at the drop. Now for the drop, let's go ahead and select all of the elements of our main loop. Copy these, Command and C, paste them at the drop. And let's have it so we just have the kick drum at the beginning. So let's delete all of these elements right here. Let's copy the kick drum again over for the second half of the drop, have the snare run all the way through, have these hi-hat loops run all the way through as well. Let's just duplicate them. And then let's go ahead, delete this effects hat noise here and grab the original one, copy this and paste that here at the end. Let's move these to the end of this as well and have this tom going all the way through the drop, these two bass loops going all the way through the drop, and these instruments going all the way through the drop as well. Except let's maybe start the drop without these two lead saw elements here. And let's have a little bit of like a pre-intro into the drop with these two sounds, this pluck saw and this pad verb. So we get something that sounds a bit like this. And then for the outro, we can basically just reverse what happens in the intro. So we can copy the kick drums, copy the snares, have them last for only half of it, copy these loops here, have them last for only half of it, have the toms last the whole time, and then have this bass sub loop here, just playing the single note all the way until the end of the track. And then let's extend out these, open up our automation, and have the mod wheel just reduce that kind of filter frequency of these sounds towards the end of the track. And let's just have them remove the last few bars. And so now we've turned our loop into a fairly basic arrangement. Let's close up all the different elements. That lasts for kind of just under 4 minutes. And of course you can go ahead, tweak further arrangements, tweak further elements in the track where certain elements come in and out. But I think that's a pretty solid starting point for a good arrangement from this cool loop. If you'd like to learn more about creating melodic techno, you can check out the Melodic Techno Academy Volume 2, which covers the whole track creation process from start to finish, including mixing and mastering, label insights, and a whole bunch of really awesome sounds. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this was useful. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you next time.